3 years after orchestrating the quiet betrayal that sent his own wife behind bars, Julian Sterling rushed through the iron gates of Oak Ridge Women's Correctional Facility amidst a relentless, blinding downpour. The storm lashed violently against his tailored, dark, bespoke suit, splattering thick mud across his pristine leather shoes, while his damp hair clung wildly to his pale forehead, like a man who had narrowly crawled out of a violent car wreck. Yet, held firmly in his trembling, muddy right hand was a pristine bouquet of white roses, a romantic gesture as theatrical as it was profoundly absurd. 3 long years ago, when he forced a pen into her trembling hand and pressed her fingers down to sign a false confession, he had not offered her a single flower. He had offered only the cold, unyielding weight of a felony record. Now, bursting into the visitor center like a frantic phantom, he gripped the reception counter so hard his knuckles turned stark white, gasping for air as security guards moved in to hold him back. His voice was hoarse, desperate, and laden with an inflated sense of unearned entitlement as he demanded to see his wife. "Evelyn Vance," he stammered frantically, his chest heaving under the damp wool of his jacket. "She is being released today." "I am her husband, Julian Sterling, and I am here to pick her up." He stood there, soaking wet, expecting her to walk through those heavy doors into his arms, completely oblivious to the reality that his performance was 3 long years too late. Officer Maria Ramirez froze, her dark eyes narrowing with a potent mixture of cold disdain and quiet disbelief as she looked up from the official facility registry. During Evelyn's 2 agonizing years behind these stone walls, Officer Ramirez had witnessed the young woman at her lowest points, burning with a terrifying fever on her narrow cot while crying out for her grandmother, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the pen when divorce papers arrived, and staying up long past midnight writing desperate legal appeals until the ink tore straight through the thin paper. To Ramirez, the name Julian Sterling did not represent a protective husband. It signified a nightmare, a prison sentence, and the darkest chapter of a young woman's youth. Without a word, Ramirez flipped through the digital log and turned the computer screen toward him. "Miss Vance left a year ago," Ramirez said, her voice dropping into a freezing, sarcastic cadence. "The case was retried, the conviction was completely overturned, and she was declared fully innocent." "Did you honestly not know?" Julian's pupils shrank drastically as he stared down at the stark black lettering. Evelyn Vance. Date of release, 1 year ago. Verdict, innocent. The words hit him like a brutal physical blow, causing his knees to buckle slightly against the marble counter. The stems of the white roses snapped in his tightening fist, crushing the delicate petals into rotting, muddy paper that clung to his palm as he whispered in utter shock. "That's impossible." Across the flooded street, sitting quietly in the back seat of a sleek black sedan, Evelyn Vance watched the pathetic spectacle unfold through the rain-streaked window. She did not roll down the glass, nor did her heartbeat flutter with residual affection or anxiety. Her expression was as still, cold, and clear as polished marble. Looking down at her phone, Her screen glowed brightly with an automated court reminder for the following morning at 9 p.m. sharp. Evelyn Vance, Julian Sterling and Chloe Bennett. Civil suit for defamation, perjury, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. With a practiced, deliberate tap of her thumb, she took a screenshot and saved it to an encrypted drive. A disciplined habit of documenting every piece of legal evidence that had been forged in the dark solitude of her prison cell. 3 years ago, she had been a naive woman who believed marriage was built on unconditional trust and mutual loyalty, convincing herself that Julian was merely blinded by Chloe's tears when he begged her to take the fall. It was only after sitting on a cold iron bunk, listening to the rain fall against barred windows, that she realized the bitter truth. Julian was never deceived by anyone. He simply evaluated her worth against Chloe's fragile comfort and decided that his own wife was the far more disposable sacrifice. Now, as she reviewed her evidence files, she felt no lingering grief, only the sharp, serene clarity of a survivor who held every winning card in her hands. Stepping out into the pouring rain, Julian stumbled across the slippery asphalt like a man completely drained of his soul, frantically redialing her old phone number over and over again. Every attempt was met with the same cold, automated recording, stating the line had been disconnected long ago, driving him into a sudden, wild fit of rage where he hurled his phone onto the pavement, shattering the glass screen into muddy water. His executive assistant, Carter Brooks, sprinted out from a parked Bentley with an umbrella, his voice strained as he tried to explain the administrative disaster unfolding before them. "Mr. Sterling, your wife. Who gave you permission to call her my wife?" Julian roared, his eyes bloodshot and terrifying as he grabbed Carter violently by his lapels. "She left a year ago! How did none of you know?" Carter lowered his head, his voice trembling, as he explained that the divorce decree, the retrial notices, the lawyer's letters, and the official court summonses had all been delivered directly to Sterling Financial headquarters and the family estate over the past 12 months. Julian had simply never opened them. He had been in Europe for an entire year, hovering over Chloe Bennett in a luxury Swiss resort, helping her recover from the trauma of the rain that reminded her of the car crash. While Julian sheltered his mistress under bright Mediterranean sunshine, Evelyn had sat in a damp cell, writing her appeals, page by page, completely erased from his selfish world. Inside the quiet warmth of her car, Evelyn put her phone away as her driver, Mr. Henderson, glanced into the rearview mirror. "It appears he's going to investigate your current address, Miss Vance. Should we head to the office?" "Let him look," Evelyn replied, her voice smooth, level, and entirely devoid of fear. "If he cannot find me, his desperation will only breed the panic he so richly deserves. Start the car." As the heavy iron gates of Oak Ridge Women's Correctional Facility slowly faded in her side mirror, Evelyn reflected on the 3 times she had returned to this place over the past year. First, on the day of her release. Second, on the day her acquittal became official. And today. She had come not to seek closure, but to verify with her own eyes that Julian Sterling looked just as pathetic, helpless, and broken as she had 3 years ago, when he abandoned her in the hospital corridor. Yet, A ruined suit and a crushed bouquet were nowhere near enough to settle his debt. He owed her 3 lost years of freedom. He owed her the life of her beloved grandmother. And he owed her the youth he had sacrificed for a liar. Taking out her second phone, she typed a single message to his new private number. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Be at the courthouse on time. She powered down the device, watching the rain wash over the glass as the car accelerated into the gathering storm. The haunting memories of that torrential night 3 years ago on the slick, winding asphalt of Storm King Highway flooded Evelyn's mind with crystal clarity. The rain had fallen in suffocating sheets, reflecting the frantic red and blue lights of responding emergency vehicles as they illuminated a horrific scene. An unconscious man lying in a pool of blood and rainwater, struck by a speeding black luxury SUV. When Evelyn arrived at the scene, she found Chloe Bennett hysterical on the roadside, her white designer dress caked in mud, clutching Julian's wool blazer while smelling strongly of expensive wine. Chloe had been driving intoxicated, striking Mr. Caldwell before attempting to flee in a sheer panic. Rather than calling an ambulance or holding Chloe accountable for her actions, Julian had immediately activated a cold, calculated cover-up to protect his firm's stock price and Chloe's pristine social reputation. With practiced detachment, Julian wiped Chloe's fingerprints from the leather steering wheel, deliberately placed Evelyn's personal driving gloves and lipstick onto the console, and staged the vehicle's interior to construct an indisputable physical narrative for responding officers. He turned to Evelyn with a gaze completely devoid of warmth, treating her not as his wife of 2 years, but as a convenient tactical asset to be deployed. In that quiet, terrifying moment under the pouring rain, the foundation of their marriage was dismantled. Julian had already decided that the woman standing before him in her innocence was far more disposable than the fragile heiress weeping beside him. At 4 o'clock the following morning, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of Mercy General Hospital, Julian executed his psychological ambush alongside his private corporate attorney. Evelyn's grandmother had just emerged from emergency surgery and was fighting for her life in the intensive care unit, with daily specialized care costs mounting to $40,000, an astronomical sum that completely drained Evelyn's modest personal savings within hours. Standing near the ICU observation window, Julian slid a pre-drafted legal document in front of her, his voice dropping into a manipulative, persuasive whisper that weaponized her desperate love for her grandmother. He promised that if she voluntarily assumed temporary responsibility for the accident, his corporate legal team would guarantee her a sentence of simple probation without jail time, while Sterling Financial would cover 100% of her grandmother's medical expenses until a full recovery was reached. "It is only a temporary arrangement, Evelyn," he urged, pressing a heavy fountain pen into her cold fingers while keeping her eyes fixed on the hospital billing portal. "Do this for your grandmother, and I will personally ensure that you are fully protected from any real harm or long-term consequences." Evelyn looked into the eyes of the man she had loved, recognizing the subtle, predatory edge behind his apparent desperation. She signed the document not out of gullible submission, but because her grandmother's immediate survival was a non-negotiable priority that far outweighed her own safety in that dark hour, choosing to fight her own battle after securing her family's life. Yet, beneath her quiet compliance lay the sharp, self-preserving intellect of a woman who refused to be completely destroyed by those she trusted. Before the police officers escorted her to the precinct for formal booking, Evelyn made a quiet excuse to use the public restroom at the end of the East Wing corridor. Nearby stood a public computer kiosk used for patient billing, where she quickly logged into her encrypted personal cloud account. Julian had ordered his executive assistant, Carter, to physically wipe the dashcam hard drive from the crashed SUV, completely unaware that Evelyn had established an automated background sync whenever the vehicle connected to local networks. Half of the high-definition dashcam footage from that fateful night had already synced to her secure cloud storage. Unmistakable video evidence, proving that Chloe was in the driver's seat, while Evelyn was nowhere near the mountain highway. Her hands trembled, not with fear or despair, but with a fierce, quiet resolve, as she renamed the file, embedded it within an inconspicuous folder, and set a scheduled automated delivery date to her personal email 3 months into the future. She knew that in a world dominated by Julian's immense wealth and legal influence, emotional pleas of innocence would be swept away like dust. She needed bulletproof physical evidence, a hidden anchor that would wait patiently in the digital shadows until the right moment arrived to dismantle his grand deception and reclaim her stolen life. The true depth of Julian's malice revealed itself with agonizing swiftness the very next morning after the heavy prison doors slammed shut behind her. Having secured her signature on the confession, Julian immediately broke every sacred promise he had made in the hospital hallway without a second thought. To preserve his corporate liquidity and fund a lavish, multi-month retreat to a luxury Swiss sanatorium for Chloe's emotional recovery, Julian quietly canceled the specialized ICU care contract for Evelyn's grandmother. He authorized her transfer to a low-tier, understaffed suburban facility that lacked advanced life support systems, dismissing the urgent warnings of attending physicians with a single directive to his assistant to minimize unnecessary financial expenses. While Julian accompanied Chloe across Europe, dining at waterfront bistros under the bright Mediterranean sun and shielding her from the slightest discomfort, Evelyn sat in a cold gray cell, completely unaware that her sacrifice had been instantly squandered. She wrote letters every week asking about her grandmother's progress, but her inquiries were met with complete silence, intercepted by Julian's legal team to keep her cooperative during the initial appeal window. In his magnificent self-absorption, Julian convinced himself that a woman trapped behind iron bars would remain forever ignorant of his betrayal, completely failing to grasp that a foundation built on deliberate cruelty bears the seeds of its own inevitable, catastrophic destruction. In the 7th month of her sentence, the fragile illusion of hope collapsed entirely when Officer Ramirez called Evelyn into her administrative office and handed her an official document with a heavy, solemn silence. It was a formal death certificate, confirming that her grandmother had passed away 3 weeks earlier due to severe post-operative infection and systemic neglect at the facility. At the bottom of the yellowed parchment, written in sharp, unmistakable cursive, was the sole signature authorizing the body's release. Julian Sterling. He had signed off on her beloved grandmother's death, buried her in an unmarked plot, and never even bothered to send a message to the woman who was serving his sentence. Sitting in that quiet room, Evelyn did not scream or shed a single tear. Instead, something fundamental within her soul crystallized into an unshakable, icy resolve. The naive, trusting wife who had once believed in love, loyalty, and quiet endurance died in that office, replaced by a formidable strategist whose sole purpose was anchored in absolute justice. She folded the death certificate neatly, placed it over her heart, and looked up at Officer Ramirez with clear, fearless eyes. Her pain had transformed into a refined, razor-sharp will to survive. She vowed that every individual involved in this conspiracy would face an uncompromising, airtight legal reckoning when the truth finally came to light, no matter how long it took. Late one night, in the damp silence of her cell, Officer Ramirez tapped her wooden baton lightly against the iron bars, watching Evelyn bent over her narrow bunk, writing frantically through a veil of bitter tears. The pages scattered across her thin blanket were a messy, incoherent outpouring of grief and betrayal, detailing how deeply her husband had hurt her and how terribly she had been wronged by the people she loved. Officer Ramirez leaned against the cold bars, her dark eyes filled with a stern yet deeply compassionate wisdom earned from years of observing human suffering. "Evelyn," she said softly, her voice dropping into a quiet, decisive whisper that echoed through the quiet corridor. "If you want to overturn a conviction in the American justice system, stop writing about your emotional pain. Stop writing about the injustice. And start writing exclusively about physical evidence. The law does not care about your broken heart. It only cares about verifiable, uncontestable facts." Those words acted as a profound awakening, instantly drying Evelyn's tears and shifting her entire focus from helpless despair to laser-focused purpose. From that exact night onward, she transformed her grief into an unshakable academic discipline. She spent every available hour in the prison library, immersing herself in criminal procedure, legal precedents, and statutory evidence laws. She devoured thick law textbooks until her fingers were calloused and her mind was sharp as a razor, realizing that mastering the system was her only path to freedom. Transforming her small, dimly lit cell into a meticulous legal workspace, Evelyn began constructing an airtight appellate dossier. She spent endless hours reconstructing a minute-by-minute timeline of the night of the accident, cross-referencing timestamps, atmospheric conditions, and vehicle telemetry models with surgical precision. She documented the exact times of hospital billing notices, cataloged bank transaction histories from Carter Brooks, and detailed the precise mechanics of the AutoSync cloud storage system. Recognizing that an incarcerated individual fighting a powerful corporate empire faced steep institutional odds, she packaged her comprehensive timeline, sworn affidavits, and digital backup manifests into a formal application and mailed it directly to the regional office of the Innocence Project, a prestigious nonprofit organization dedicated to exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals through post-conviction forensic evidence and investigative advocacy. For weeks, she waited in patient solitude, continuing her daily legal studies while maintaining absolute composure during roll calls and yard time. Her application was not an emotional plea for mercy or pity, but a brilliant, highly structured legal brief that left no room for doubt or ambiguity. When the organization's intake committee reviewed her dossier, they immediately recognized the extraordinary caliber of her analytical work and the glaring investigative failures of her original trial, assigning her case to one of their most formidable senior appellate attorneys to begin formal post-conviction proceedings immediately and systematically. The arrival of attorney Diane Montgomery marked a decisive turning point in Evelyn's battle for justice. In her mid-40s, with cropped dark hair and a commanding presence that radiated unwavering authority, Diane sat across from Evelyn in the attorney visiting room, laying out her strategy without a trace of empty pity. "I don't offer comfort or emotional platitudes, Miss Vance," Diane stated plainly, tapping her fountain pen against the wooden table. "I offer exoneration and justice. Give me the facts." Evelyn handed over her structured files, leading Diane directly to the first piece of undeniable physical evidence: the time-stamped security footage from Mercy General Hospital. On the night of the accident, at precisely 9:17 p.m., hospital cameras had captured Evelyn, standing at the automated billing kiosk in the East Wing, completing a transaction for her grandmother's care. The fatal collision on Storm King Highway, located on the far western edge of the county, had occurred at 9:21 p.m., exactly 20 miles away. To cover 20 miles of winding, rain-slicked mountain roads in 4 minutes was a physical impossibility, establishing an absolute airtight alibi that her original court-appointed attorney had negligently failed to investigate or present. As Diane examined the verified timestamps and geographic mapping data, a sharp, triumphant smile touched her lips. She looked up at Evelyn with profound professional respect, recognizing that the woman sitting before her in a gray prison uniform had independently assembled an unassailable legal foundation. The momentum of truth became unstoppable when Mr. Caldwell, the victim of the crash, unexpectedly emerged from his extended coma at a specialized rehabilitation facility. Though frail and bound to a wheelchair, his memory was crystal clear when interviewed by Diane's investigative team and federal prosecutors. He firmly testified that the driver who had struck him was a frantic woman wearing an elegant white dress, smelling strongly of alcohol, a description that matched Chloe Bennett perfectly, not Evelyn. Furthermore, Diane's team successfully recovered a crucial piece of digital evidence from a 24-hour convenience store situated at the base of the highway. Though the store's exterior camera had been damaged, the archived hard drive yielded blurry yet definitive footage of Chloe stumbling out of the driver's side of the SUV, sobbing hysterically into her phone minutes before Julian's car arrived to stage the scene. Combined with the high-definition cloud backup footage Evelyn had secretly preserved, which clearly captured Chloe's profile behind the wheel in the moments preceding the crash, the evidentiary puzzle was complete. The false narrative manufactured by Julian and his corporate legal team completely disintegrated under the weight of incontrovertible forensic proof, demonstrating beyond a shadow of a doubt that Evelyn had been the innocent victim of a criminal conspiracy, paving the way for her complete exoneration, public restoration, and ultimate justice in the eyes of the law. The day of the retrial arrived under a brilliant, cloudless blue sky, reflecting the complete clarity of the courtroom proceedings. Sitting at the defense table where she had once been condemned, Evelyn stood tall as the presiding judge reviewed the overwhelming body of evidence presented by Diane Montgomery. The gavel struck the wooden block with a resounding ring, echoing through the silent courtroom as the judge formally overturned her original conviction, erasing all felony charges and issuing a full, unconditional acquittal. The courtroom erupted into quiet murmurs of relief, but Evelyn did not weep. She simply closed her eyes, exhaling 2 years of heavy, suffocating air as true freedom returned to her lungs. Upon returning to the facility to process her release, she gathered her meager belongings: a plain wedding band, her grandmother's photograph, and Julian's old dress shirt. With quiet, unshakable dignity, she tossed his shirt into the trash receptacle and handed the wedding band back to Officer Ramirez as formal evidence for her upcoming civil fraud lawsuit against the Sterling family. After signing her final discharge papers and filing a petition for unilateral divorce, Evelyn walked through the heavy iron gates of Oak Ridge, stepping into the golden sunlight as a free, triumphant, and unbowed woman who had reclaimed her destiny, her dignity, and her future through her own unwavering courage and intellect. When Julian returned to the exclusive Sterling family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, he walked into a scene that shattered his remaining composure. Chloe had casually moved into the master suite, her designer wardrobe occupying the closets, while Evelyn's belongings, her books, her personalized mugs, and the cherished framed photograph of her grandmother had been completely cleared away. The housekeeper later quietly confirmed that Chloe had ordered everything packed into trash bags and thrown into the dumpster behind the garage. When Julian confronted his mother, Eleanor Sterling, demanding to know how she could allow Evelyn's personal history to be erased so callously, Eleanor merely took a slow sip from her porcelain teacup and delivered a cold, scathing rebuke. "She is an ex-convict, Julian," Eleanor sneered, her voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. "Her things belong in the trash. What did you expect us to do? Build a permanent shrine for a woman who disgraced our family name?" Julian stood paralyzed in the center of the living room, looking around at the freshly redecorated space with a sudden, suffocating wave of nausea. For 2 years, Evelyn had silently managed this vast estate, waking at dawn to accommodate Eleanor's delicate dietary restrictions and enduring her mother-in-law's constant verbal belittlement without a single complaint. Now, seeing how effortlessly they had discarded every trace of her existence, Julian felt the first terrifying tremors of a truth he had spent 3 years avoiding. They had not merely wronged an innocent woman, they had systematically dismantled a devoted wife who had protected them all. The true administrative disaster unfolded hours later when Julian summoned his corporate legal team to investigate Evelyn's marital status, only to be handed an official court document that rendered him completely speechless. The decree of divorce was not a pending petition or a threat. It was a legally binding, finalized judgment issued by the state court a full 12 months prior. His head attorney nervously explained that after Evelyn was fully exonerated, her legal counsel had initiated a unilateral divorce action. When Sterling Financial's legal department and the estate's butler repeatedly ignored official certified mailings while Julian was in Europe sheltering Chloe, the court had authorized service of process via public notice in major newspapers. Having satisfied all statutory requirements without an appearance from the defense, the judge had granted a complete, irreversible dissolution of the marriage, formally noting on the record that marital affection had been irretrievably broken by the husband's gross misconduct. Julian stared blankly at the gold judicial seal, his mind struggling to comprehend that while he had been playing the heroic protector to his mistress in Swiss resorts, Evelyn had legally stripped him of his title as her husband. He was no longer her spouse, her guardian, or her peer. Under the strict eyes of the law, he was merely a stranger against whom she held a mountain of unresolved legal claims, leaving him clutching a piece of paper that confirmed his absolute exclusion from her future. At 7 o'clock the following evening, Evelyn arrived at the Sterling estate, responding directly to a demanding text message Eleanor had sent, attempting to summon her for an imperious family reconciliation. As the grand double doors opened, Evelyn stepped into the foyer, wearing a crisp, tailored navy suit, her posture radiating an unshakable, quiet authority that immediately silenced the crowded living room. Eleanor, Julian, Chloe, and several prominent Sterling relatives sat assembled, expecting a humbled, broken woman who would bow to their social dominance and accept their terms. When Chloe stepped forward, offering a cup of tea with a sweet, delicate smile, Evelyn did not reach out her hand. Instead, she looked Chloe dead in the eye and set the teacup firmly back onto the silver tray, her voice slicing through the silent room like a polished blade. "You don't need to play the hospitable, dutiful host for my benefit, Chloe," Evelyn stated with ice-cold precision, before turning her sharp gaze toward Eleanor. "And let me make one thing abundantly clear to everyone sitting in this room tonight. I am not here to negotiate a reconciliation, nor am I here to seek your validation or approval. I am here to formally order all of you to never, under any circumstances, refer to me as Mrs. Sterling ever again." That title was destroyed by your collective dishonor, and I have discarded it permanently. Without pausing to allow Eleanor's rising indignation to manifest, Evelyn pulled a thick manila folder from her leather briefcase and laid an itemized financial spreadsheet across the mahogany coffee table. During her 2 years of marriage, Eleanor had repeatedly pressured Evelyn into transferring substantial sums into a private family account, claiming the funds were necessary for family trust obligations and high society charitable functions that a dutiful daughter-in-law was expected to support. In reality, Eleanor had exploited Evelyn's quiet devotion to siphon away $500,000 consisting entirely of Evelyn's premarital savings and the modest rental income left behind by her late grandmother. For 2 years, I refrained from keeping score because I foolishly considered you family, Evelyn declared, her clear eyes locking onto Eleanor's twisting expression. In prison, I learned a vital lesson. Whenever you fail to audit your enemies, they turn your quiet generosity into a weapon against you. Here are the bank statements, wire transfers, and text records documenting every single transaction. Evelyn tapped her finger firmly against the total sum highlighted in red at the bottom of the page. This is not marital property. This is premarital capital fraudulently converted under false pretenses. I expect full civil restitution of $500,000 wired to my legal counsel's escrow account within 7 business days, or my attorneys will file a formal civil fraud complaint in federal court before sunrise. As Chloe stepped forward, attempting to intervene with her signature tearful cadence, accusing Evelyn of becoming bitter, cold, and vindictive, Evelyn reached into her jacket and placed a sleek digital voice recorder onto the table. Pressing the play button, the quiet living room was suddenly filled with the sharp, unambiguous audio recorded in the hospital hallway 3 years prior. Chloe's tearful, frantic voice echoed clearly through the speaker. "Julian, I was drinking. I can't go to prison. Please make Evelyn take the fall. She loves you. She'll do it." Followed by Julian's low, exhausted response. "I will make her sign it. She won't leave me." Chloe's face drained of all color as the recording continued, capturing her distinct voice, instructing Carter Brooks to ensure the dashcam hard drive was completely wiped so that no one will believe a word Julian's wife says. The room plunged into a suffocating, deadly silence as the relatives stared at Chloe in absolute horror, realizing that her fragile, innocent persona was a sociopathic facade. Julian turned to look at Chloe, his eyes filled with profound disgust as he saw his mistress clearly for the very first time, not as a fragile victim needing shelter, but as a ruthless manipulator who had used him to destroy his innocent wife. As Evelyn picked up her recorder and walked toward the exit, the toxic alliance between Julian and Chloe officially disintegrated into bitter, irrecoverable ruin. The third-floor grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was packed to absolute capacity as Chloe Bennett held an emergency press conference, attempting to regain control of the rapidly crumbling public narrative. Dressed in an immaculate white silk gown, her hair softly styled and her eyes glistening with artfully manufactured tears, she stood behind a rose-adorned podium, bathed in the blinding, continuous flashes of dozens of media cameras. She delivered a choked, heart-wrenching monologue, painting herself as a fragile, innocent society woman who was being ruthlessly harassed, stalked, and defamed by an embittered ex-convict. "I have stayed silent for years out of pure compassion," Chloe whimpered softly into the microphones, dabbing her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. "I deeply understand that Evelyn Vance suffered during her time in prison, but targeting me with fabricated audio clips and public slander will not rewrite the past. I only want peace for my family. Yet she is determined to ruin my life and destroy the Sterling family reputation out of sheer malice and greed. The theatrical performance was calculating and persuasive, designed to weaponize public sympathy and turn media sentiment against Evelyn before the civil trial even commenced. Reporters shouted questions, eager to consume the high society drama, completely unaware that the fragile victim weeping on stage had built her entire public persona upon a foundation of dangerous, sociopathic lies and deception. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted dramatically when the heavy, gilded rear doors swung open and Evelyn Vance stepped into the hall alongside senior attorney Diane Montgomery. Wearing a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, Evelyn walked down the center aisle with absolute composure, ignoring the sudden frenzy of camera lenses pivoting violently toward her. Without exchanging insults, making emotional outbursts, or engaging in petty verbal sparring, she walked directly up to the audiovisual technician's booth at the side of the stage. She handed the technician a high-capacity flash drive, instructing him in a firm, authoritative whisper to override the main display feed immediately. Seconds later, the massive projection screen behind Chloe went dark, before lighting up with high-definition digital footage from Storm King Highway. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, breathless silence as the video played. Chloe, visibly intoxicated in her muddy white dress, stumbling out of the driver's side of the crashed SUV, screaming into her phone, "I've been drinking. Julian, you have to save me." The crystal-clear audio echoed loudly through the ballroom speakers, followed immediately by the recording of Chloe instructing Carter Brooks to wipe the dashcam hard drive. Chloe turned around, her face instantly draining of all color as she stared at the giant screen in sheer, paralyzed horror, her carefully crafted facade shattering before the eyes of the nation. Before Chloe could utter a single word of defense, the side doors opened, and Mr. Caldwell was rolled into the press conference by his daughter, his dignified presence commanding immediate reverence across the room. The frail, wheelchair-bound victim looked directly into the news cameras, his trembling voice resonating with quiet, undeniable truth that chilled the audience. 3 years ago, the woman who struck me with that car and left me bleeding in the rain was Chloe Bennett, Mr. Caldwell declared clearly, his voice steady despite his frail physical condition. She was drunk, she fled the scene, and her family paid hush money to cover it up. Evelyn Vance was never behind that wheel. The press corps erupted into immediate pandemonium, shouting relentless questions as the incontrovertible evidence pinned Chloe and Julian to the wall. Julian, standing near the edge of the stage in a dark suit, looked utterly broken as the media turned their lenses upon him, demanding an immediate response to the damning revelation. Caught in the blinding light of public exposure and unable to hide behind corporate public relations any longer, Julian closed his eyes and finally spoke into a reporter's thrust microphone. "I lied," he confessed, his voice cracked with agonizing humiliation and defeat. Evelyn Vance was completely innocent. forced her to take the fall to protect Chloe. The admission sent shockwaves through the room, officially ending 3 years of systematic, cool deceit. As the ballroom descended into complete uproar, 2 uniformed federal marshals and local police detectives pushed firmly through the crowd, stepping onto the stage with handcuffs drawn. Interrupting the frantic commotion, the lead detective read Chloe her Miranda rights, officially placing her under arrest before hundreds of flashing cameras and live television broadcasts. Chloe shrieked in sudden terror, her delicate persona evaporating into hysterical screams as she clawed at the podium, begging Julian to save her one last time. "Julian, do something! You promised you'd handle this, you promised!" she screamed, her voice echoing raw, sharp, and frantic through the hall. Julian stood motionless, his head bowed in absolute defeat, refusing to meet her desperate gaze as officers pinned her arms firmly behind her back and escorted her out of the Waldorf Astoria in handcuffs. Reporters scrambled to capture every second of the spectacular downfall, broadcasting live footage of the society heiress being loaded into the back of a police cruiser. Standing near the edge of the stage, Evelyn watched the arrest with a serene, unshakable calm. There was no wild glee or petty spite in her heart, only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a woman who had allowed truth and justice to clear her name, watching the stage of Chloe's public deceit transform into the very altar of her judgment and reckoning. The subsequent criminal trial moved swiftly through the federal court system, resulting in a sweeping, uncompromising victory for justice and the restoration of truth. Chloe Bennett was sentenced to a lengthy term in federal prison for vehicular assault, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Ironically, remanded to Oak Ridge Women's Correctional Facility to serve her time in the exact same halls Evelyn had once walked. Julian Sterling was convicted for his role in the destruction of evidence and corporate conspiracy, receiving a suspended sentence, massive community service mandates, and severe regulatory bans from executive leadership. The public exposure triggered a massive federal investigation into Sterling Financial, causing the firm's stock to plummet and driving its reputation into irrecoverable ruin. In the civil proceedings, the judge granted Evelyn full economic restitution, punitive damages, and emotional distress compensation totaling millions of dollars, fully executing her claims against the Sterling estate. Yet, for Evelyn, the financial settlement was merely a footnote compared to the true prize she had secured through her own unwavering resilience. She had dismantled a corrupt corporate empire, cleared her name before the world, and reclaimed her absolute freedom, stepping into the future with an unbowed spirit, an unblemished reputation, and an unshakable sense of peace that no one could ever take away from her. In a stroke of profound poetic justice, Chloe Bennett was remanded to Oak Ridge Women's Correctional Facility to serve her federal prison sentence, crossing the threshold of the exact same heavy iron gates where Evelyn had once suffered in quiet, agonizing isolation. The cold, unyielding reality of incarceration swiftly stripped away every layer of her fragile, aristocratic arrogance, transforming her dismissive superiority into hysterical, hopeless sobs that echoed continuously down the gray concrete corridors. The inmates, many of whom recognized her from the broadcast press conference, offered zero sympathy for her tearful drama, forcing her to confront the stark, unvarnished consequences of her own sociopathic choices and criminal cover-up. Meanwhile, Officer Ramirez sent Evelyn a brief, professional text message confirming Chloe's intake, noting that the former high society heiress had wept uncontrollably through the entire booking and fingerprinting process. Sitting in her quiet office, Evelyn read the message with serene detachment, feeling neither malice nor petty schadenfreude. She knew better than anyone that tears shed behind iron bars do not automatically signify genuine remorse or moral awakening. Often, they are merely tears of bitter self-pity, wept over being caught and held accountable for one's actions. Chloe was finally walking through the dark, suffocating valley she had designed for someone else, learning the hard way that when you construct a cage for an innocent person, the door eventually swings open to lock you inside instead. Weeks later, amidst a soft, persistent afternoon drizzle, Julian drove out to the quiet suburban cemetery where Evelyn's grandmother was buried, clutching a bouquet of white chrysanthemums like a man carrying an unbearable, eternal penance. Finding Evelyn quietly wiping down the marble tombstone with a damp cloth, he approached with slow, hesitant steps, his face ghastly pale, his eyes sunken and bloodshot from sleepless nights filled with regret. Dropping to his knees on the damp grass directly before the grave, he bowed his head and wept bitterly, desperately offering to establish a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation in her grandmother's name to fund specialized medical treatments for underprivileged hospital patients. Evelyn did not halt his weeping, nor did her expression soften as she listened to his strained, raspy pleas for forgiveness. Instead, she set her cloth into the water bucket and looked down at him with an icy, razor-sharp clarity that cut through his performance. "Do not dare use my grandmother's sacred name to cleanse your wretched, self-serving conscience, Julian," she interrupted, her voice perfectly level, carrying an absolute, unshakable authority. "You stood by while her specialized ICU medical care was canceled, and you signed her release authorization without a second thought. A delayed awakening is just as cheap as a delayed love. Your late arriving remorse holds zero value here, because it cannot restore a single breath of the life you helped extinguish." Rising slowly from the wet grass, Julian reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers and produced a velvet box, opening it to reveal a sleek, newly crafted platinum diamond ring, an identical replica of the plain band he had given her on their wedding day. His voice cracked with a desperate, pathetic urgency as he begged for a single chance to rebuild their life, promising to surrender every corporate asset he possessed to make amends for his sins. Evelyn looked at the shimmering band, then reached into her handbag and pulled out a certified copy of their finalized divorce decree, placing the folded paper directly over the open ring box in his hands. "You were not merely a day late at the prison gates, Julian. You were a lifetime late," she replied smoothly, her gaze remaining steady and completely devoid of anger or affection. 3 years ago, in that hospital corridor, you weighed my worth against Chloe's comfort and decided I was disposable. I accept that you pled guilty in court, but I choose never to forgive you. Forgiveness is a personal choice, and I refuse to grant you the emotional absolution you crave to ease your guilty mind. Some doors do not need to be slammed in rage. They simply need to be shut quietly, permanently, and left behind forever as you walk forward into your own life. Using the substantial financial restitution awarded from her civil lawsuit, Evelyn partnered with senior attorney Diane Montgomery to officially establish the Innocence Documentation Project, a dedicated nonprofit legal foundation headquartered in a bright, modern office space. Their mission was clear and uncompromising, providing specialized investigative resources, evidence auditing, and post-conviction advocacy for marginalized, underprivileged individuals who had been wrongfully convicted or forced into silence by powerful corporate interests. Evelyn poured her soul into the work, transforming the pain of her past into a beacon of hope for others struggling in the dark. She organized complex case files, built digital evidence timelines, and trained volunteer legal scholars on how to audit corrupt police reports and uncover hidden forensic proof. When she returned to Oak Ridge Correctional Facility to deliver legal education seminars to the inmates, Officer Ramirez walked beside her toward the front gates, remarking with a proud smile how much she had transformed over the years. "When you first arrived here, Evelyn, you were like a fraying, fragile thread," Ramirez recalled softly. Evelyn smiled, her eyes reflecting the warm, golden sunlight above. "And now?" she asked. "Now?" Ramirez replied firmly. "You are a razor-sharp blade." Evelyn chuckled gently, knowing that a blade forged in fire could never be easily snapped by cruel hands again. Eventually, Evelyn relocated her life and her primary foundation office to the picturesque coastal town of Carmel by the Sea, California, where the ocean breeze carried the sweet scent of salt and vibrant bougainvillea bloomed along the sunlit streets. Every morning, she opened the massive arched windows of her seaside home, allowing the sweet, warm Pacific sunshine to fill her living room as she poured a fresh cup of warm water and set it neatly beside her grandmother's framed photograph. Looking at her grandmother's kind, smiling face in the soft morning light, Evelyn felt a profound, unshakable sense of freedom settle deep into her soul. She was no longer Mrs. Sterling, no longer anyone's sacrificial lamb, and no longer a victim bound to the ghost of an old betrayal. She had walked through the fiercest storm of her life with her head held high, transforming her wounds into wisdom, her pain into purpose, and her tragedy into triumph. She leaned against the window frame, watching the golden sunlight dance across the ocean waves, knowing that the greatest lesson learned from enduring torrential rain is not waiting around for someone else to bring an umbrella, but having the courage to walk out of the storm yourself. She was simply Evelyn Vance, a free, triumphant, and unbowed woman who had finally stepped into her own bright, beautiful sunlight.